Welcome to Tales from the Bridge. This is episode 62, and recently Sam, Marty, and myself sat down with Eric Choi and have a fantastic conversation. We hope you enjoy this one. Check out the show notes for links to Eric's work. We've got stuff going on in January, so stay tuned for more interviews and interesting conversations. All right, everyone's waiting for us. Let's make our way over to the bridge.
Today on Tales from the Bridge, we have Eric Choi, who I met at a space policy conference at Western University in London in September. And I was introduced to him professionally because Eric works for GHGSat, that's Greenhouse Gas Satellite, which is a super interesting company and out of Montreal, and I hope we're going to talk about that. But then when he was introduced on stage for his panel, the person that introduced him also said, and Eric has also just published his first collection of science fiction short stories. So boom, there we go. That was amazing. So I reintroduced myself and invited him on the show to talk about both science fiction and science fact, which is something we also do on the show. So welcome to Tales from the Bridge, Eric.
Oh, it's such a pleasure to be here, Marty. Thank you so much. And as I said, as I recall saying when you emailed me about this, I approached this with a little bit of trepidation because I had a look at your list of previous guests and I find myself a little bit intimidated. I don't hold a candle to a lot of the other people that you've been fortunate to have on this show, but it's going to be, I think, fun to chat, and I look forward to it. I'm very grateful for this opportunity.
Oh, well, we're really happy to have you, Eric, and I appreciate the flattery. We do like flattery whenever we can get it. We've been lucky to have some big names, but we've also had a pretty diverse set of science fiction creators on the show and scientists, and so I think our listeners are very broadly interested from what I can tell. So yeah, I'm looking forward to this conversation. So let me just go right ahead and say your book, which has just been published, it's called Just Like Being There. It's a collection of, I believe, 15 short stories, which you've written, I imagine, over many years, since the first one was, there's a great afterword after every story where you sort of tell us some more about the science in the story and where it came from and some of the history. And I know the first story you wrote as an undergrad, was it, at the University of Toronto?
So, as Marty has pointed out, I got started writing through a contest, and it's a competition that's now called the Dell Magazine's Award. And this is something that was put together at the time by Rick Wilbur, Sheila Williams, and the late Gardner Dozois as a way of encouraging and incentivizing young writers to get into the genre. So I actually entered the contest, and it was called the Asimov Award back in the day. I was the first recipient of the award in the first year that it was offered, which, to this day blows my mind, and I can't. It's kind of unfathomable that did happen. But the result of that was the short story dedication, which appropriately opens my collection, Just Like Being There, that was just published really by the academic publisher Springer Nature. I guess it would be last year now. We're in 2023, and perhaps that's a bit of a remarkable fact as well. Is I originally had no idea that Springer, which is better known, of course, as a scientific and academic publisher, in fact has a science and fiction line. They have a science fiction line of books, and this was my collection was printed under that imprint.
So Just Like Being There is a collection of your short stories. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And
right.
Was there sort of a couple standout stories for you? And what were you talking about? Like, when we love the idea of introducing emerging authors, and you've emerged clearly. So we're a little late to the party, but when you look at that, at Dragon and the Stars, what are a couple key stories and some elements that went into them?
That's a difficult question, actually. It's kind of like saying, which child or which relative you like or love the most, and all of the stories span the many years of my writing career, and each is a snapshot of a point in time of where my headspace was, and what inspired me, or what was even in the scientific literature at the time that might have influenced me. I will say though that the collection, just like being there, is actually a subset of my stories. So there's 15, and by the nature of Springer Nature, the publisher, and again that traditionally or primarily they are a scientific and academic publisher. So this collection was actually focused exclusively on my hard SF and alternate history stories. And that was also the rationale to providing the afterwords to each of the tales, where I delve into a little bit of the background, the history, and the engineering, the science that is illustrated as part of the story. So in addition to hard SF, believe it or not, I've actually delved into a little bit of horror. I tried my hand at comedy once. This was a collaborative effort with Joseph McGinty in Derek Newman Still's anthology, We Shall Be Monsters. And this was a collection of stories inspired by Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. So the story that Joe and I wrote was called A Postmodern Prometheus, and it was intended to be a humorous take where there's a modern day Victor Frankenstein that is struggling to find or raise funding to be able to actually build this monster. And that actually turns out to be the most difficult part of the enterprise. So I've tried to write. I've written that, an attempt at humor, and I've written a story over a pandemic, for all the terrible suffering that it has inflicted. In some ways, for some authors like me, has been actually quite positive. There has been a positive aspect from the standpoint of focusing, and getting some productive writing done. I do have an unpublished story that has elements of fantasy and Inuit folklore in it that I hope perhaps might see the light of day at some point.
Wow, that all sounds great. I look forward to the next collection. Now, yes, I'm glad to hear that you're also writing other things. When I started reading this collection, I was like, oh, this guy's really into hard sci-fi. And it's a very hard science fiction. And like you say, alternate history. Raise the Nautilus, the second story, I think, in the collection, is a great little piece of alternate history. It's a very specific genre, and it's full of science, and it's full of engineering, and it's full of facts. And, you really draw, like you said, your inspiration from the literature, and then you explain it. So each story I found really educational, really mind-opening. I haven't finished all of them. I actually just read From a Stone just before this interview, which I really, really liked. It's a first contact story about the discovery of an artifact. And it sort of addresses this notion of, what would we find? What would be evidence of intelligent life if we found an artifact or a signal? There are regular things you point out. There's hexagonal tunnels in this asteroid, and bees, make hexagonal tunnels, and that's life, but it's not necessarily intelligent life. I mean, it's a certain kind of intelligence, I guess, a social intelligence. And I love the resolution here, and I just want to tell people about it because I thought it was quite lovely. The astronauts that are exploring these tunnels in a asteroid get to the middle, and there's basically a little cubby hole, and in that cubby hole is a sequence placed in a circle, a sequence of stones, which increase. Each stone is twice the mass of the one before it, and I thought this was a beautiful little, element of this. Not only is it twice the mass, but it's twice the diameter. And if you think about it, right, twice the diameter, right, doesn't mean it's going to be twice the mass if it's the same density. So it must be an engineered, thought through carefully, right, that each stone must also become less dense, because mass scales as volume, which is, radius cubed rather than just radius. So if the radius is double and the mass is double, that means, and that you've changed the density. And so it's a great little signal, right? It's a sign of intelligence, to simply find that. So That was a great story. Thank you for that.
Thank you so much. So a few years ago, that story was reprinted in an anthology called Far Orbit that was edited by Bascom James. And Bascom wrote these little intros to each of the stories. And the one he wrote for From a Stone floored me because he compared it to Rendezvous with Rama, which I think probably, sort of swelled my head, for at least a day. But that was tremendously gratifying. The other aspect of that story that I was trying to convey, and this sort of ties back to my career and my interest in real life space exploration, is I was in fact very much influenced by one of my favorite nonfiction books, which is A Man on the Moon by Andrew Chaikin. And this, I really consider Chaikin's book to be the definitive history of the Apollo missions of the late 60s and 70s. And if you remember back in the 90s, there was a wonderful HBO miniseries called From the Earth to the Moon that had its basis in Andrew Chaikin's book. So what impressed me about the book was the geology and the science that they were attempting to do on the moon, but under tremendous constraints. That, if you remember the Apollo program as obviously being a wonderful engineering and scientific achievement, but that was of course not its genesis. Its genesis was a Cold War competition with the then Soviet Union, and the point was really just to send people to the moon and bring them back. And that's exactly what Kennedy said, and that's all they were meant to do. So, the science that came out of it, while important, was in some ways secondary to the main mission objective. And indeed, there was only one scientist who ever made it to the moon in the Apollo programs, and that was Dr. Harrison Schmitt, the geologist on the last mission, Apollo 17, in 1972. Actually, we just recently passed the 50th anniversary of Apollo 17. But, they had so little time to do science on the surface of the moon because they were constrained by their resources. They were constrained by orbital dynamics. They were constrained by the hardware that, even Apollo 17, they barely spent 3 days on the surface. And, you can imagine trying to explore a landmass the size of the continent of Africa in 3 days. No, it's not going to happen. So this sort of hit and run science, doing the best we can, that was part of the tension that I tried to convey in the story From a Stone. So the scenario there was that this was a spacecraft that was actually at the end of another mission. So things like fuel and consumables were already low, and they weren't expecting to make this amazing discovery on this asteroid. And gosh, we need to explore this further. We need to learn more. But then they have to leave because they just can't stay. They don't have the resources to stay, and they leave behind all these unanswered questions and mysteries. And at the end, what they're exploring really does is really raising more questions than answers. And I think, that says a lot about, the nature of progress and the nature of science as well.
That's really great. Eric, can you tell our listeners a little more about aerospacewriter.ca? I'm just browsing through the website, and it's really well laid out, and there's so much here, from technical writing to information on your short stories. We're going to have a link in the show notes for any listeners that want to check out Eric's website, but it looks fantastic. Can you tell us about that? Because do you run that yourself, Eric? And is this
I do run it myself, for better or for worse. This is probably a strange thing to say for somebody who allegedly has an engineering background, but I don't consider myself that savvy when it comes to maintaining a website. So, Tristan, if you thought it was okay, I'm very gratified. It was actually my good friend, the writer and editor Mark Shaneblum, who actually originally set it up for me. But I do maintain it myself, and so on the website you can find sort of the latest and greatest news of what I've been up to, synopses of my short fiction, links to various interviews and presentations I've done over the years, including this one, presumably in short order. And so some links to some of the technical and engineering type of writing that I've done in the past as well. So Aerospace Writer is actually my social media handle as well. So you can also find me on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook.
I just want to ask you about, and this is something we debate about here about, between hard sci-fi writing and so far as, versus other styles, fantasy oriented stuff. So for me, I'm always a little harder on hard sci-fi because I like a good story, and you do a great job of finding a balance between the story and the science. Does one take precedence over the other in your process? Like, do you find that they can be at odds with one another? Have you, and as a follow-up, have you ever sort of compromised the science for the story or vice versa?
I have compromised the science for a story. So actually the title story, Just Like Being There, I describe a type of instantaneous communications, basically, the Ansible that Ursula Le Guin came up with. And there is a totally hand-waving explanation for how that works. And I say it's based on quantum entanglement and reality. That can't happen. You cannot achieve faster than light communications with quantum entanglement because basically you would still be conveying information faster than the speed of light, and it just doesn't work that way. But I needed that for story purposes. So in answer to that, yes, I have waved my hands on occasion. I try to minimize that though. A lot of what I do is I try to do a lot of near future stuff. So that is in many respects, quite challenging because reality tends to catch up with things. So in the case of some of the older stories in Just Like Being There, I did do some minor tweaks and revisions to some of the older stories, including From a Stone. And the good news there is that I was pleasantly surprised to discover that most of them held up pretty well. Where it didn't hold up is, for example, in the original publication of From a Stone, I had certain dates. I believe the story was, or that we discovered this particular anomalous asteroid in 2021, which obviously was an eternity ago in pandemic years. So, I had the simple expedient of just moving the dates to the right. And, in my defense, I believe Bradbury did the same thing when the Martian Chronicles were reissued.
Yeah.
But, that tension, if you have between sort of story and science, I think between those two things, and this is speaking to somebody who, got started reading that really, really old school stuff of, Clarke and Asimov and even going back to Jules Verne in my, elementary school days is, I love idea-based stories where there's just something cool there. But at the end of the day, it still has to be a story. It has to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. So if push came to shove between those two elements, I would prioritize rather, plot and story.
Ever wondered what it takes to make it in the movie business? Peel back the curtain with 4-6 Success Filmmaking. 4-6 Success Filmmaking is where filmmakers share their stories and the secrets.
It's beyond competitive out there.
There have been movies that it's taken me 10 years to get made.
Don't wait to create. You've got to just keep making stuff.
Tune in to 4-6 Success Filmmaking for your dose of cinematic realness, direct from the voices that have lived it.
Oh, well, sure. I mean, fiction is in the title of the genre, right? I mean, I think that's always forgivable, but but with hard sci-fi writers, it's sometimes hard to tell where things kind of get inventive and where they don't, and I sort of I enjoy sort of trying to figure out where that point is, particularly as a non-science person, and it's often the stuff that I think is sort of far fetched that someone's like, oh no, that's real. And then, so it to me, that's always sort of what blows me away when we sort of dig into this. In terms of your process, do you sit down, do you grow it out of a scientific concept, or do you have like a story idea and then you start introducing your science knowledge into that?
It could be both. So when Marty mentioned from a stone, that idea of sort of a binary message of basically engineered stones, each facet or dimension of the stone being double the next, that actually came from an article that I had read in the publication of the Planetary Society. So there are cases where the idea comes first. The On the other side of that is could be that I've come up with a story that I want to tell, and I sort of do the research after the fact to to either set the background, the premise, or to move things along. In terms of the process of my writing, I tend to be quite methodical, and this probably is an artifact of my background as an engineer. And before I say more about that, I should caveat that writing, obviously, as a process of creativity, is deeply individualized and deeply personal. So anything I say just means that it's the way I happen to do it. It's neither right nor wrong, and it may or may not work for other people. If there might be emerging writers who might be listening to this, but I guess perhaps befitting of my engineering background, I do tend to be quite rigorous. So I actually plot out stories, even short stories, to a great degree of detail. So I don't have an example for you right now, but I will literally have sticky notes where I've sketched out scenes, and then I'll move the sticky notes around. And what is the flow of things? What happens next? I keep little spreadsheet notes of characters, to keep things like their personal history, backgrounds, and things consistent. And a little more recently, I've been also doing that to sanity myself, to make sure that things like background and ancestry and gender, that I'm having good diversity in my characters.
Mm-hmm.
And I've got I tend to keep extensive files on a folder somewhere of research notes. I tend to be a bit old school there, that despite everything, I tend to still print things out and highlight and scribble all over them. It's something that hasn't quite been replicated. But I actually don't start a first draft of a story until I've got that plot outline in place. And the other thing that's again part of my own personal process is I need to have a title before I'll start writing. And it doesn't it could purely be a working title. Most often it is. And the plotting that I described with the sticky notes, it doesn't mean that I pedantically stick to that, but I do feel that I need to have that structure before I can even start writing a first draft. And then I emphasize again that this is my personal way of doing things. It's neither right nor wrong for anybody else. And ultimately, as a creative process, every writer does their own thing, whatever works for them.
No, I love hearing about the process, and that makes total sense. I mean, that's how you avoid a plot hole, right? Or some.
Well, it's cheating. It's cheating to an extent that I can claim that I've never had writer's block. That when I write the first draft, I just go from beginning to end. And the reason is because I've cheated. Is the writer's block had already happened at the outlining stage with the sticky notes.
Like Neil Gaiman also says, there's a different kind of cheating that goes on when you write a story. You write the story, and then you go back through it, and you make it sound like you knew what you were doing all along. You put in all those things that you found out at the end throughout the whole thing. So, yeah, that's what makes a good story.
I would tend to agree with that. And who am I to disagree with Neil Gaiman? But my process of writing is when I do get to that first draft, I just barrel through from beginning to end. I do not revise at all at first draft. I just go. My objective is to produce words and produce pages. Once I've got it done, it's done. I close the file and I try to leave it behind me for at least a week. Try to give myself some cooling off. And then I come back to it and I try to approach it as a reader. So, I'll put it on my Kobo or, back in the day, I would print out a copy and I would sit on the couch where I normally read and try to look at it with fresh eyes. And then that's when the revision process starts. So stories are not so much written, but they're very much rewritten.
And how do you fit it in? You're a busy guy. You're a professional. You're the director of business development for GHGSat. I'm sure you've got a very full schedule. Do you just fit it in sort of anywhere? Do you write on the bus? Do you wake up on Saturday morning and that's your time? Or how do you do that?
I don't do it very often. So I'm hardly the most prolific writer. It's probably why I've never churned out a novel, for example. So, I've had just over 21 stories published now, which in the grand scheme of things is not that impressive. But yeah, I do try to balance, a rather busy career, a very privileged career in my dream of being in the space sector. But when it comes to writing, it frankly it becomes another job and another task. So when I've got a writing project going, I will print out a calendar, or I'll get a calendar or whatever, a physical calendar, and I will write down the number of pages I've written on a given day. And the goal there is that I must write at least one page a day, or I don't go to bed, and that's it. And it could be gibberish, right? As I said earlier, I sort of barrel through things the first way around, but that's the discipline that I feel that I need to actually schedule writing in with other things, and then make myself do it. And don't get me wrong, this is enjoyable. I love writing, but it is work, and it does take a degree of planning and dedication to squeeze it into everything else that any writer would have in their lives.
And that's common of a lot of the authors that we've spoken with, is that they schedule their writing time and they treat it like they're going to work. They're disciplined about producing work. So it sounds, you've spoken in very familiar terms, I think, to the three of us here. It's that's what it takes to produce work. And as you said, you've been doing it for some time. And if we can go back just to 2011, a book, you were an editor, a co-editor on The Dragon and the Stars, which was the first collection of science fiction and fantasy stories written by authors of the Chinese diaspora. And it won the 2011 Aurora Award in the Best English-related work category. Could you tell us a little bit about that experience? That was something that sort of just jumped out at me, and I was hoping you could dig into for us.
Well, that was a lot of fun, and that is one of the projects that I was most proud of. So it was very much a collaborative experience with my good friend, also an editor and author, Derwin Mack. And it came about because Derwin was, I'm trying to remember which World Science Fiction Convention, which Worldcon this was. This was the one in Yokohama. Could that have been something like 2007, I believe? And given that he was in the Asia Pacific for that Worldcon, he had the opportunity to meet a lot of science fiction writers and academics from China and other Asian countries. And as a result of that, Derwin and I and Tony Pai and Melissa Yuan Innes were interviewed for a Chinese publication, sort of describing, Canadian science fiction authors of Chinese ancestry. And so shortly after this happened, Derwin and I had a dinner appropriately at a Chinese restaurant in Chinatown here in Toronto. And I honestly don't remember who blurted this out, but one of us did. And we looked at the print of the article, and one of us said, these authors here would make one terrific anthology. And that's how it happened. So we had no idea of how this would go about, but fortunately, we are blessed to have very good friends in the field. And in this case, the wonderful Julie Cherneda, who you must get on the bridge, as another example of somebody who is a scientist and a speculative fiction writer. Because of her contacts at DAW and Techno Books, we were able to get this project underway. And I said, this is something that Derwin and I are tremendously proud of. And we would like to think that it was, to our knowledge, the first dedicated collection of speculative fiction written by Chinese ancestry authors in the diaspora outside of China. So we are, quite pleased and quite proud of this project. Thank you for bringing it up.
It's on my. It's just made our my reading list. I was just going through your website now and saw that jump out at me. And what a great opportunity to gather your favorite stories together under one title, under one roof, and to bring that forward. It's a fantastic opportunity. What's next for you? What are you when you look at what your trajectory is and where you want to go next? What's can you break anything here? We don't want you to reveal secrets if you've still got things sort of tucked away, and we totally understand that. But is there can you give us some hint as to what we might expect from you next?
Well, I really consider myself first and foremost a short fiction writer, being a writer not only of short fiction but of physically short stature as well. I'm sort of making a hand gesture here. You're not going to be able to see this in the audio. I really think that that's my passion and that's my strength. I have outlined a novel that I may or may not get to one of these days. I'd love to do another anthology of some kind, either a collection of my own work or some themes that I've been kicking around with some different publishers. But again, first and foremost, I do consider myself, that the form that I'm most comfortable is the short form. So I think I mentioned this earlier that COVID and the pandemic has been a terrible tragedy for too many people. But from the writing standpoint, it's had some positives. So you mentioned Raise the Nautilus, that was written during pandemic. I've a story last year that I was quite pleased with called A New Brave World. So this was in a collection of stories about interstellar travel called Brave New Worlds. And forgive me, it's a little bit confusing because the titles are similar, but the premise of my story is the civilization that was portrayed in Aldous Huxley's famous 1932 novel, Brave New World. What if that level of technology had somehow achieved interstellar spaceflight? So that's what that story is about. And looking ahead to 2023, which I'm still getting used to this. So this will take me days, but so this year now, I look forward to a few more stories coming out. So I just submitted a story to Tony Pye and Stephen Kotowicz for one of their upcoming anthologies. The anthology will be called Game On, and this is an anthology that will be speculative fiction stories about games of various kinds. So I've written a story for them called Random Access Memory, which has to do with video slot machines and a very unusual thing that certain people experience when they're playing this particular video slot machine at this casino. I'm also very pleased that next year there is going to be an anthology called Life Beyond Us. This is an anthology that's being put out by the European Astrobiology Institute and the Laxa Media publisher. This is Lucas Law's company in Alberta. And this will be a collection of stories about astrobiology, so life in outer space. And very similar to Just Like Being There, each story will be accompanied by an essay that is written by a practicing scientist in that particular field. So I'm very happy that I will have the opening story in this Life Beyond Us collection. It's going to be called Hemlock on Mars, and it's a story of a bit of a different twist of the issue of whether we find life on Mars or perhaps we inadvertently bring life there, and what is to be done about that. And so I'm looking forward to that. And there's going to be so I've been very fortunate to have been published in analog a number of times, which is obviously the sort of the nirvana for any hard SF geek like me. But I will have my fifth story in analog, which will be called Beware the Glob, and it will be about a dangerous extraterrestrial creature that is unleashed from its frozen Arctic slumber by climate change. And if that sounds anything like a 1950s movie, it's kind of intentional that way. So
The Thing from outer space.
Well, I just being careful with copyrights here, but I was a bit of a fan. When I was a kid, there was a film called The Blob that absolutely terrified. Steve McQueen was a little too old to play a teenager by that point, and I actually make reference to that in the story. But it was a story that Trevor Chakri, the editor of Analog, and I bonded on because, I hid under the bed when I saw that movie because, surely, that blob was going to go after a little kid like me. And I certainly related to that. So we were, both mutually terrified by that, by that classic horror film. And so I, decided to do a little bit of a hard SF twist on that one, and so that's going to come out in analog later this year.
Oh, very cool.
That's exciting. Wow.
Oh, that's all really exciting. Hey, you touched on an interesting topic that actually we just posted to our Facebook group, or I just did. The topic that you touched on was contaminating Mars, right, with life. And we live in right now. There's I gather, a pretty kind of a revolution, right? We're living in this time when we're realizing microbiology is just so much richer than we ever knew. We're finding microbes everywhere. We're finding them in the stone. There are microbes whose metabolism eats rock. It doesn't even need oxygen. There's microbes in volcanic vents. There's microbes on clouds. Apparently, there's microbes everywhere. And so the survivability of the durability of life, I think we're learning, is extremely pervasive. And if we do go to Mars, or if we go to another planet, our chances of contaminating, especially if we're looking for extraterrestrial life, our chances of contaminating that planet are pretty big. And so it sort of really affects the whole dialogue and conversation for me suddenly about the value of human exploration. If we go somewhere looking for life to explore there, but it turns out that we're just so dangerous to these pristine places that the astronauts will ultimately have to just lock themselves inside a sealed hermetic room. um, that really affects the value of sending people there. Why send people there if they're just going to sit in a bubble and operate remote controls for machines that we could operate from here. And your fiction addresses that, I think, a lot. You've thought a lot about this, and you work in the space industry. I'd love to just hear your thoughts about like the value of robotic versus human exploration today.
Well, it's so interesting that you bring that up, Marty, because my upcoming story, Hemlock on Mars, is precisely on that topic. So there's something called planetary protection, and this is um, uh, uh, it's a set of agreements or protocols that have been agreed to by most of the major space agencies of the world, and it reflects compliance with a clause in the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, which says basically, thou shalt not contaminate other bodies in the solar system with harmful material, and the reverse of that's forward contamination, that there shall be no back contamination as well, that you're not going to bring anything harmful or dangerous back from space. I guess the Andromeda strain
Right.
syndrome. So what we do is when we send these spacecraft to places like Mars, and potentially to other places in the solar system of astrobiological potential, like say Europa or Titan, is there are actually protocols in place to clean or sterilize as best we can this hardware before we send it. So in my aerospace career, I was very privileged to have worked on a Mars lander mission called Phoenix, for which Canada provided a laser sensing, an atmospheric laser sensing instrument, and I was very privileged as part of my early career to have worked on that. But planetary protection protocols were first and foremost on that project. So things had to be wiped down with disinfectant, with alcohol wipes, and then bio assays had to be taken. So basically, swipes were taken, and then things were cultured to see how many spores actually came out. And there are criteria of how many spores per square meter are allowed before something can be deemed suitable or sufficiently cleaned and decontaminated to go to Mars. So the story that's going to come out in the Life Beyond Us anthology this year, my story Hemlock on Mars, deals precisely with planetary protection and what might happen if we suddenly discovered that we actually didn't decontaminate the spacecraft to the level that we thought we did. So what do we do about it then? This thing is on its way to Mars. What's to be done? So please read the story to find out. But this whole discussion between the relative merits of human versus robotic space exploration, that was actually the central premise of the title story of my collection, Just Like Being There. So the story was originally published in one of Julie Chernada's anthologies. It was called Tales from the Wonder Zone. This was a collection that she put together with the idea of using science fiction to illustrate what were then um, basically curriculum topics in the Ontario elementary school and high school science curriculum. So at that time, there was a space exploration unit, I believe, in something like grade 6 or something. And so this story was very much examining that. The premise being that after a series of tragedies, we kind of call it quits and say, this thing of sending people into space, maybe it's just too dangerous, and we should do it all with robots. And then this is what led to that hand waving, Marty, I talked about earlier, the need for this instantaneous communication with the spacecraft, because this is one of the biggest impediments to until very recently, when we're starting to develop things like better autonomy and artificial intelligence, that the time lag that's just a few seconds perhaps to the moon, but could be on the order of 15 or 20 minutes going out to Mars, and on the order of hours out to the outer solar system. That would tend to argue that we really ought to have people there. And certainly we've seen, for example, in the Apollo missions, that there is a capacity for human beings to be curious and to make spontaneous discoveries. But even then, the one time that we sent people out of low Earth orbit in Apollo, going back to some of my earlier comments, their time was so constrained that they were almost biological robots, that they had very detailed procedures on their moonwalks, on their EVAs, that you go here at such a time, you dig this and you drill this far and you get this sample. That a lot of the benefits that we would have supposed for having human eyes and ears on site didn't really materialize to the extent that we would have expected in the Apollo program. And maybe this will change as we head back to the moon and go on to Mars. But certainly there are other challenges associated with sending people in space, and Marty, you alluded to some of them, that in some of the cases of wanting to decontaminate these spacecraft going to Mars, for example, the Viking missions, the first successful soft landers in the 70s, because they had astrobiological experiments, they actually went beyond the sort of disinfectant wipes that I described for Phoenix. They actually did something called a dry heat microbial reduction, which was basically putting this thing in a humongous oven, at 150 degrees Celsius for 3 hours at a time. This is obviously something that is not well recommended for doing to people. So, these are the issues that we're going to have to tackle and deal with, if we are to be, serious about eventually sending people to Mars or other places in the solar system, as has been so often postulated in science fiction.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I mean, I gather something I've learned recently. There's part of what we're learning about microbiology and all these new sort of classes of microbes is that there's lots of microbes that don't culture. So we look for everything by culturing it, or we have until now. But there could be all sorts of things that are still left on there that evaded our cleaning techniques, and we swab and we culture, and they just don't culture, but they're still there. So there's a whole extra level, I think, of to do there.
You know what, Brian? Marty, rather. The next time I write a story, I'm going to have to tap your biophysics background here, because I really should have talked to you before I wrote this story, because you've basically outlined the whole story for me right there, because that is exactly what happens in my story, where it turns out that the contaminant is a microbial that does not culture.
Right. Well, that's great. And then, and then the next level, though, is if you send a human, they're just a walking bioreactor, right? If you just let them outside, any kind of accident, a tear in the suit, right, it just basically will release thousands and thousands of different microbes out there, and some of them might survive. And so it's a pretty complicated problem. Or at least it's a high price to contemplate, right? The more you think about it, for the improvisational ability of humans when they're there, especially when everything is so controlled that humans aren't given that improvisational ability anyway. And so,
well, that was the experience during the Apollo program. My hope would be that, if and when people go to Mars, and assuming that these issues of forward contamination and protecting any indigenous astrobiological biomes is resolved, that there'll be a lot more time, I hope, for people to be doing science on the surface of Mars than they did in Apollo on the moon.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, since we're talking about science, we've had you almost an hour here, and we haven't talked about GHGSat yet, and I think it's a fabulous story that I'd love to share with our listeners. So, I don't know if I need. By way of introduction, GHGSat, it's a satellite. It's a Canadian company. You guys have put up a satellite with special infrared cameras And the infrared cameras are basically, able to detect wavelengths that are very characteristic of chemical compounds. So you can basically have this sort of chemical fingerprint from the spectra that you read, that can detect whether you're seeing carbon dioxide or methane, or I'm sure many other things. And I'm surprised actually to learn that this is the first time we've done this. I would have thought we'd had satellites doing this for a long time. And so these satellites can now, map the entire planet and see emissions. And you made the news very quickly. I think there was a couple big news stories with, you were able to detect super emitters, basically super polluters out of Russia, I'm sure, just to sort of quantify like how much their factories or some of their factories are polluting compared to others. And then also you were able to detect the explosion, the destruction, the sabotage, I guess, of the Nord Stream pipeline, I believe.
The
So
Nord
these are
Stream,
big
that's right.
stories. Why don't you tell us about the company, tell us about your role, and tell us about some of these stories.
Well, so my day job is I'm director of business development at GHGSat, and this is one of these new space, small and nimble new space companies that you've heard about. So it's headquartered in Montreal, and we actually have 6 satellites in space right now doing global monitoring of greenhouse gas emissions, specifically methane. We've got 6 more satellites launching this year.
Oh, wow.
So we'll have a good dozen up there by this time next year. What makes GHGSat unique, and Marty, you're exactly right that there are other satellites that measure greenhouse gases, but the difference is that the previous satellites, Sentinel 5P, Tropomi, and others, is that they look on a very broad scale and at very low resolution. So something like the Tropomi instrument on Sentinel 5P, it has a swath or view of about 2,500 kilometers across, but its pixel size is 7 by 5 kilometers. So we've taken a bit of the opposite tact, is we only look at a 12 by 12 kilometer patch, 12 by 12 kilometer field of view, but within that we have very high spatial resolution, less than 30 meters. And what this means is that we can attribute a leak right down to an individual facility, like an oil pad or a vent at a coal mine or a part of a landfill. And this is the part that's never been done before. And what really amazes me about this is this is all being done by an SME, a small Canadian company headquartered in Montreal with about 100 employees. These are these little microsatellites that you've probably heard about. So it's not these big bus-sized, Hubble Space Telescope types of things. Our satellites are about 15 kilograms, and they're about the size of a microwave oven. And they're built in Canada. So our current batch of satellites was built at my alma mater of the University of Toronto, the Space Flight Laboratory. And what is really remarkable to me, that this is a true Canadian success story, because all of this technology came out of Canada. We're a Canadian company. The satellites were built at the University of Toronto. The sensors, the instruments, it's our design, it's our IP, but they're built by a company called ABB in Quebec City. We have an airborne version of that instrument that's built by Honeywell in Ottawa. And the ground stations where we take the data down from our satellites are operated by an organization called Secor in Newfoundland and Labrador. So literally all of this is done in Canada, except for the rocket launch. So for example, our most recent batch of 3 rockets went up on a SpaceX Falcon 9. So we can do everything in Canada except launch the satellites. And I understand there's people working on that too. Yeah, there's people working on that. So maybe in a few years' time we'll have that option too.
Yeah, apparently we're getting a launch site in Nova Scotia or on the East Coast somewhere. Yeah, that's amazing. Very cool. And how does this make money? Who pays for this? Or do people buy the data? Or you're the business development manager? This is the question right for you.
We so most of our clients are actually in the commercial sector. So these would be operators of energy facilities, oil and gas facilities, landfill operators, that they themselves actually have a very strong incentive to clean up and to stop these methane leaks, both from the standpoint of regulation, also environmental activism, but ultimately the bottom line as well, that especially nowadays with the geopolitical situation in Ukraine and others, with energy prices the way they are, if you're leaking methane, not only is that a terrible thing for climate change, but that's basically like dollar signs flowing into the atmosphere. So not only are you doing the right thing by capping it, is that now you recovered product that you can sell and make money at. We also service the scientific community. So GHGSat is what's called a third-party mission of the European Space Agency, ESA. And what that means is that ESA procures our data and then makes it available for free to scientific researchers in Europe. And very recently, we signed a contract with NASA for what's called to be evaluated under their commercial small sat data acquisition program. And at the end of that process, the end of that evaluation process, we hope similarly to have our data widely available to the American scientific community as well.
So one thing I do want to know before we wrap up here is, why have we seen such a jump in just getting stuff to space recently? And I mean, we've had so much time. There's been many decades we've been able to do this. What is it about the last decade that has companies like yours popping up and us getting stuff into space and us exploring a little more?
I think there's two aspects of that have enabled this. One is the realization that the private sector has capabilities to offer that do not in any way replace government space programs, but complement them, so that you have these two solutions coming together, doing things that either of them alone would not have been able to do. And if we had more time, I could, talk about the work we do with the Sentinel-5P ESA satellite, where they look at the wide view and, they see an area of elevated methane, but they don't know the source. And say, hey, GHGSat, have a look at that and find out where that elevated level is coming from. That's an example of the private sector and the public sector working together for the greater common good. And so that has really been embraced. Commercial capabilities have been embraced, and then related to that is what has been done to reduce the cost of going into space. So, say what you will of, shall we say, the personalities behind SpaceX, but what cannot be disputed is the tremendous impact that the SpaceX rockets, the Falcon rockets, have had in lowering the barriers to entry and really democratizing space, that even a small 100-person Quebec-based company can launch a fleet of to be able to afford to launch a fleet of microsatellites is truly something that is revolutionary.
Okay, I'll give Elon a pass for today.
I did not mention him by name.
No. Well, thank you, Eric. I think that's been an amazing conversation. We covered a lot of ground.
Yeah.
Really appreciate you coming on the show. We loved hearing about your fiction, and we look forward to more and hearing reading your next collection. And thanks for being so erudite and well informed. Always appreciate
Well,
that.
Marty,
And
Tristan,
for-
Sam, thank you so much. This has been so much fun and just a great way to kick off 2023 for me. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Eric. We really enjoyed having you on the show. Thanks, everyone, for listening. Lots coming up in January, so stay tuned. The TFTB. Once again, thank you. Until next time.